In 1933, the White House served emergency food, while hungry men accepted soup from a gangster. 6 years later, colored stamps gave an unemployed factory worker something unexpected: the right to choose her own dinner. The Great Depression did not begin in a kitchen, but that was where millions of Americans had to confront it every day. By 1933, more than 12 million workers were unemployed. The average unemployment rate had reached 24.9%. Banks had failed, life savings had vanished, and families that had considered themselves secure only a few years earlier were suddenly calculating how many meals could still fit inside the money they had left. The hardest part to understand is that the United States had not stopped producing food. In many regions, farms were accumulating wheat, milk, pork, and other commodities without enough buyers. Food existed on one side, undernourished people stood on the other. What was missing was a bridge. Before that bridge existed, dinner depended on three things: whatever remained in the pantry, how much fuel was available for the stove, and the ability to turn repetition into dignity. The 10 dinners in this story were not eaten in exactly the same way across the country. Diets changed by region, culture, access to gardens, and the kind of relief available. Together, however, they reveal how the crisis moved from the family pot to the public breadline, and from the breadline to a new national responsibility. The first dinner was preserved not in a government report, but in the memory of a teenage girl. If you love real history told through the dinner plates of the people who lived it, subscribe now, because the first dinner on this list was preserved by a teenage girl who decades later returned to her own kitchen to make sure that memory would never disappear. Number 10. Clara's Skillet. Clara Cannucciari was born in 1915 and grew up in Melrose Park, just outside Chicago, in a Sicilian-American family. Many decades later, as an elderly woman, she returned to the kitchen in front of her grandson's camera and prepared meals her family had eaten during the Depression. One became known as the poor man's meal: potatoes, onion, and small pieces of hot dog cooked in the same skillet, sometimes with a little tomato sauce. It was not a modern recipe designed to look historical. It was a household memory that had survived for nearly 80 years. The intelligence of the dish was in the order. Onion created aroma, potatoes provided volume and absorbed the flavor of the fat. The hot dog did not have to feed each person on its own. Sliced into pieces, it made the entire skillet feel like a meal that contained meat. The most expensive ingredient stopped being the center of the plate and became seasoning. But the human turning point was not hidden in the ingredients. It was in her mother's decision to serve the food as dinner, not as a random collection of scraps. The skillet arrived hot. The family sat down. The meal had a name, a smell, and a ritual. Clara preserved a truth statistics rarely capture. During hard times, cooking can also be an attempt to protect children from the feeling that everything around them is collapsing. And when even a small amount of meat was out of reach, another food did the heavy work. Number 9. The pot of beans that bought time. The Depression did not invent the bean pot, and no single region could claim one definitive version. That was precisely its strength. In the South and Appalachia, beans might appear beside cornbread. Along the Gulf Coast, they met rice. In the Southwest, they entered meals shaped by Mexican and Mexican-American traditions. In immigrant neighborhoods, the seasoning, fat, and side dishes changed, but the logic remained the same. Dried beans could be stored for long periods. They expanded in water, and they could carry the flavor of a small piece of fat or a bone through a meal for several people. A pot of beans solved part of the cost problem, but created another. It required water, fuel, and hours of cooking. Cheap food was not always cheap for someone living in a room without a proper kitchen or paying carefully for coal and gas. Poverty charged for time, too. That was why the pot mattered beyond one night. The broth could thicken the next day. The beans could be mashed, served over bread, or combined with whatever became available later. The meal was not merely cooked, it was designed to continue. Families had practiced that kind of household planning long before any federal program existed. But by 1933, the government was studying kitchens like these and trying to turn survival into nutritional arithmetic. The result would become one of the strangest and most revealing ideas of the entire decade. Number 8. When dinner became an equation. During the crisis, home economists were handed an almost impossible assignment: create diets that cost as little as possible while still preventing serious nutritional deficiencies. In 1933, USDA food economist Hazel Stiebling developed food plans at 4 cost levels. The most restricted plan was intended for emergency use. The idea sounded cold because, in a way, it was. Foods were being judged by the energy, protein, minerals, and vitamins they could deliver for every cent spent. In that system, cereals, milk, potatoes, beans, and inexpensive vegetables took priority. Pleasure did not disappear from every kitchen, but many official menus treated flavor as secondary. White sauces, cornmeal mush, cream vegetables, and enriched breads could return in different forms throughout the week. For a family, however, repeating the same ingredients without announcing that the food was running out required creativity. Mush served hot at night could cool, be sliced, and browned the next morning. Stale bread received gravy. Potatoes thickened soup. Science counted nutrients. The person at the stove also had to count appetite, embarrassment, and exhaustion. Out of that tension between the laboratory and the dinner table came Milcorno, which we will reach shortly. First, one flexible stew acquired the name of the man many Americans blamed for their condition, and the recipe came with a protest built into it. Number 7. The stew that carried a president's name today. The dish commonly called Hoover stew is usually described as a mixture of macaroni, canned tomatoes, available vegetables, and, when possible, sliced hot dogs. It was inexpensive, made a large pot, and could change with the contents of the pantry. But one detail matters. There is no single firmly documented origin for the recipe, and no inventor who can confidently be given credit. The name survived because it matched the bitter political language of the time. Makeshift settlements built by homeless Americans were called Hoovervilles. Newspapers used as blankets became Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags. Placing President Herbert Hoover's name on a modest stew transformed dinner into political commentary. That does not mean every family used the same name or the same ingredients. It means a flexible dish became a symbol of collective anger, the belief that ordinary citizens were being forced to improvise while institutions responded too slowly. In the pot, starch from the macaroni and liquid from the tomatoes created body. A few pieces of hot dog could spread through many bowls. In conversation, however, the main ingredient was irony. The dish proved that hunger was not silent. Even when a family could not march in the street, it could still give hardship a name. Then the crisis produced an even more unsettling scene. In Chicago, thousands of people lined up for soup provided by one of the most feared men in the city. Number 6. The Gangsters' Soup. In November 1930, a soup kitchen opened at 935 South State Street in Chicago. A sign offered free soup, coffee, and rolls to the unemployed. The man behind it was Al Capone. According to contemporary records gathered by historians, the kitchen served coffee and sweet rolls for breakfast. Lunch was soup and bread. Dinner was soup, coffee, and bread. On an average day, roughly 2,200 people were served. No proof of need was required, and people who were still hungry were not denied a second helping. On Thanksgiving Day in 1930, approximately 5,000 people were fed. The operation strengthened Capone's image as a benefactor at exactly the moment he needed favorable publicity. There is also evidence that some supplies may have been obtained through pressure on businesses rather than simple generosity. Here is the uncomfortable human turn. Law-abiding men were forced to accept dinner from someone associated with organized crime. The line stretched near police facilities. A city determined to put Capone behind bars could not stop him from appearing more present than the government to people who needed food. For the person holding the bowl, the contradiction was practical. Refusing the soup would not punish the gangster. It would only leave less food for the family. Need defeated symbolism. Capone did not solve hunger in Chicago. His soup kitchen operated as charity publicity and public accusation at the same time. It exposed the empty space left by an institutional response that was still far too weak. If you value stories where one ordinary meal reveals what public speeches leave hidden, subscribe to the channel, because the next dinner was not served by a criminal. It was designed by scientists and carried into the White House. Number 5. Milcorno. food designed in a laboratory. In the early 1930s, a Cornell team led by Flora Rose developed Milcorno. Its base combined cornmeal and dried skim milk, fortified with calcium and vitamins. The goal was to deliver low-cost nutrition to families hit by the crisis. At first, the product was sold to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution. Cornell home economists claimed that replacing part of a family's ordinary flour and cornmeal with Milcorno could help a household of 5 eat for less than $5 a week. The name suggests nothing more than porridge, but recipe pamphlets tried to give it several identities: tamale loaf, chili, fried polenta, and even gnocchi. That reveals the real problem the researchers had to solve. It was not enough to place nutrients inside a bag. Real people had to be persuaded to eat the same product again and again. Flora Rose and her colleagues worked in a field often dismissed as little more than domestic chores. In reality, they were dealing with public health, household budgets, and food distribution. The team received only nominal royalties and shared its knowledge of vitamin enrichment with commercial producers at no charge. Milcorno was not a miracle food, and it did not eliminate poverty. It was an attempt to prevent the loss of income from turning automatically into malnutrition. Eleanor Roosevelt saw more than a formula in the experiment. She saw a political message. If ordinary families were being told to eat economically, the presidential household should demonstrate the same principle. That was how a 7.5-cent meal reached White House China. Number 4. The 7.5-cent meal. In 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt presented what was described as a correctly balanced meal, costing 7.5 cents per person. The documented menu included hot stuffed eggs with tomato sauce, whole wheat toast, mashed potatoes, prune pudding, and coffee. One factual distinction matters. That specific meal was lunch, although many modern retellings turn it into dinner. Separate newspaper accounts reported that Milcorno appeared at White House dinners. Eleanor's purpose was to demonstrate thrift and nutrition during a national emergency. The decision carried symbolic force. The White House would not pretend the country was still living in abundance. The gesture also drew criticism. Food calculated in a laboratory could meet cost and nutrition targets without delivering pleasure. Franklin Roosevelt enjoyed good food, and the presidential household's simple meals developed an unflattering reputation among some visitors. That contradiction makes the story human. Eleanor was not choosing only a menu. She was deciding what kind of example a first lady should set. Serving luxury dishes could look indifferent. Serving austere food could look performative because she would never face the same insecurity as an unemployed family. Still, for a brief moment, eggs, potatoes, and prune pudding turned the presidential table into a public argument about the lowest acceptable price of a dignified meal. Far from Washington, another simple soup entered one woman's memory not because it was austere, but because of where it was served. Number 3. The soup that helped build a mountain. During the New Deal, workers built Timberline Lodge on Oregon's Mount Hood. The project brought together laborers, craftsmen, and artists and became one of the best-known achievements of the Works Progress Administration. Marjorie Hoffman Smith contributed to the art and design work connected to the project. In a 1964 oral history recorded by the Smithsonian, she remembered visiting the construction camps. They were large tents in a cold environment, and the meals she remembered best were great bowls of potato and onion soup. Decades later, when she could have spoken only about handmade furniture, woven fabrics, blacksmith work, or the architecture of the lodge, Marjorie remembered the soup. The meal was simple. Potatoes provided body and energy. Raw onion added flavor and texture. But context changed everything. These workers were not standing in a bread line waiting for charity. They were earning wages to build a public landmark. Dinner followed a day in which their skills had become useful again. This is the third major human turning point. The same bowl that could suggest dependence in a soup kitchen could represent belonging in a work camp. Not because the food had changed, but because the person's relationship to it had changed. Timberline Lodge is still standing. The soup disappeared as soon as it was served. Yet the soup remained in Marjorie's memory for nearly 30 years. The New Deal did not feed only the adults it put to work. The next transformation began when the government recognized how many children were arriving at school unable to pay for lunch. Number 2. the school lunch that protected dinner. At the beginning of the Depression, schools, parent groups, charities, and local governments were already trying to feed students. The scale of the crisis overwhelmed those networks. In 1932 and 1933, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation loaned money to towns in southwestern Missouri to pay the workers preparing and serving school lunches. In 1933 and 1934, the Civil Works Administration and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration expanded that support. The work reached 39 states and employed 7,442 women. That number contains two stories. Children received meals, and women confronting the same economic crisis received paid work preparing and serving those meals. The government then began connecting schools to agricultural surpluses. By March 1937, 3,839 schools were receiving commodities and serving 342,031 children every day. 2 years later, the figures had grown to 14,075 schools and 872,259 students. The foods changed with the surpluses available. Federal programs had acquired products including pork, dairy foods, and wheat. The irregular supply did not create a perfect menu, but it did build a bridge between farms without buyers and students without lunch. The effect reached the family home. When a child ate at school, the small amount of food in the kitchen could stretch farther into the evening. In that sense, school lunch also protected dinner. Another detail shows that organizers understood the weight of shame. Program rules required that children unable to pay should not be segregated, discriminated against, or identified in front of their classmates. Feeding children without humiliating them became part of the design. If someone in your family remembered school meals, food lines, or pots that had to last for several days, share that memory in the comments. Stories like those preserve what official reports can rarely show. School lunch proved that government could move food to people. But one more intimate question remained. Who would have the right to choose what went home? Number 1. Mabel McFiggin's colored stamps. On May 16, 1939, Mabel McFiggin entered a grocery store in Rochester, New York, and became the first recipient of America's experimental food stamp plan. Mabel was an unemployed factory worker. Accounts of the first purchase report that she chose butter, eggs, and prunes. None of those items sounds grand. That is precisely what made the moment revolutionary. Until then, much food relief had arrived through distribution lines or pre-selected boxes. A family received whatever the program possessed, in quantities determined by someone else. The new system used orange and blue stamps. Participants purchased orange stamps equal to what they would ordinarily spend on food. For every $1 in orange stamps, they received another 50 cents in blue stamps. Orange stamps could purchase any permitted food. Blue stamps could be used only for products the Department of Agriculture classified as surplus. The first retailer to redeem the stamps was Joseph Mutolo. The transaction reconnected 3 people the crisis had separated. A farmer needed a buyer. A grocer needed a customer. Mabel needed to feed her household. Milo Perkins, the program's first administrator, described the problem as a gorge. Farm surpluses on one cliff and undernourished city residents on the other. The stamps were an attempt to build a practical bridge. But there was a deeper change. Mabel did not receive calories alone. She entered a store as a customer and made choices. The program still required participants to purchase part of the stamps, excluding people with no cash at all and limiting its reach. It was not a complete solution. Even so, it returned a small measure of control to the person who would eat the meal. Over nearly 4 years, the first program reached approximately 20 million people at one time or another across nearly half of all American counties. At its peak, it served 4 million participants. The program ended in 1943 as wartime employment absorbed much of the joblessness and agricultural surpluses disappeared. Butter, eggs, prunes. The first purchase did not look like a banquet, but it changed the meaning of relief. From accepting whatever remained to choosing, within limits, what a family needed. That made it the most important dinner on this list before it was ever cooked. Great Depression meals should not be romanticized. Household ingenuity was born under pressure. Many people remained undernourished, and relief did not reach everyone equally. Local barriers, discrimination, and the requirement to purchase part of the stamps excluded families with serious needs. But the decade changed the relationship between food and government in the United States. Emergency food plans turned nutrition into public policy. Milcorno demonstrated how universities could work with relief agencies. Soup kitchens revealed the limits of isolated charity. Work projects connected wages, food, and dignity. School meals linked farm surpluses to children. And food stamps created a direct ancestor of the system that would later become SNAP. The greatest legacy was not one recipe. It was the idea that a society cannot treat mass hunger as nothing more than an individual failure. A potato could thicken a soup. A small piece of meat could flavor an entire pot. A school lunch could make the food at home last until dinner. And 2 pieces of colored paper could return the power to choose. In the next video, we will open the lunch pails of the workers who rebuilt America. Miners, factory hands, lumberjacks, and road crews, to discover what they really carried through 10 or 12 hours of work. Subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes the history of an entire country can fit inside one battered cooking pot.